Chip Taylor, one of my mentors, as well as Scott's mentors. It's really a cool privilege to go to school the same place that your son goes to school, and then have the same instructor and have him influence both of us. If any of you have ever been subjected to having me answer your questions with questions, you can blame Chip at the end here. Several years ago, we began the Monarch Watch, which is a citizen science project over 30 years ago. Chip is director of the project, and one of the things that occurred to me is when I saw a recent paper that he and others put out that was arguing for a hypothesis that helped to explain the decline of monarchs, was this would be a good topic for us in this as biology teachers. So there you go. That's what we're about. And I think what we'll do is turn it over to Chip, one of my mentors, and his presentation. Then afterwards, we'll be sure to answer questions, ask questions while the presentation, and we'll try to get to them. We got 15 minutes at the end. Okay, so here we go. I think here we go.
Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Chip Taylor. I'm director of Monarch Watch at the University of Kansas. We're part of the Kansas Biological Survey at the university. I wouldn't be here today talking to you about monarch butterflies hadn't it been for getting to know the Williamson family, Brad, Carol, and Scott. They've been our supporters for a long, long time. In 1992, I started to look around for a new project. At that time, I had been working on so-called killer bees, and I knew that work was going to come to an end, and I needed to pick up something else. And monarchs looked like a good project. We didn't know a great deal about the dynamics of the migration, and I thought it might be useful to start a migration project involving large-scale tagging. I pitched the idea to Brad, and Brad and I discussed the various possibilities, and he agreed to help. Brad encouraged me to get teachers and students involved, but I was a little reluctant. But it turned out he was right. Teachers and students can do the job that we needed to have done. We needed to have a lot of people tag monarch butterflies. So the project started with 2 news releases, pitching the idea that we needed the public and teachers and students to tag monarch butterflies. This worked out really well, and we were flooded with a response. Brad printed the tags, and we mailed them out to people from Minnesota to Texas. And a lot of those were teachers who worked with our students. At the end of the project, the public was so intrigued by this, and the response was so positive, and the response from the teachers was extremely positive. We realized that we had something really valuable and that we needed to continue it. And this led to the creation of Monarch Watch, a program that continues to this day. Monarch Watch has now tagged over 2 million butterflies in the last 29 years, and we have over 19,000 of those tagged butterflies recovered in Mexico. The data is a goldmine and can be and has been applied to many questions about the monarch migration, and there are still many questions we intend to answer. Well, today we're going to use those data to talk about one of those approaches that we had, an approach to this controversy as to why monarch populations have declined. Now, there are lots of reasons for the decline, but we're looking at the major decline, the major factors, and 2 have been proposed. One is that there's a limitation of the milkweeds out there, that milkweeds have been largely eliminated in many key areas. And the other is that the migration has had inordinate amounts of mortality over the years, which has led to the decline in the population. Well, we're going to use those data to address this question. Which is it? Habitat loss or migration mortality? Well, with that, I want to finish, and I want to thank again and give a shout out to Brad and Carol Williamson for their staunch support over the years. It's been really, really helpful. And if you ever have an idea about a project, you might talk to Brad, or maybe not, because Brad will get you to do it. He's good at that. Well, with that, we'll stop and we'll go to the slides. Thank you very much for having me speak to you today. All right, let's go to the slides. As I said, the subject of this talk is going to be habitat loss versus migration mortality, that is, mortality during the migration. So to answer that question, we really have to know the subject well, and that means that we have to know our monarch butterflies. This is a nice male. You can see that the males have narrower veins, or appear to have narrower veins than the females, which appear to be darker. So it's relatively easy to distinguish the sexes. That's nice because it allows us to determine roughly the differences between the sexes and as they migrate, as they're feeding, and so on and so forth. So there are some nice sex differences that we can track because the males and females are more distinctive than they are in most butterfly species. Well, let's review the overall migration to get an understanding. I know most of you know this, but let's do it anyway. The monarchs are now arriving at the overwintering sites. That's that blue dot that you see where it says winter down below in Mexico. That's in the Transvolcanic Ridge. It's an area between Mexico City and Morelia in Mexico. The butterflies are overwintering at about 12,000 or 10,500 feet, maybe up to 12,000 in some cases. They arrive there starting around the Day of the Dead, so they're still arriving at the overwintering sites right now, and they will continue to arrive until the end of the first week of December. They stay at the overwintering sites for approximately 4.5 to 5 months, and then they begin moving north, usually at the end of February or the beginning of March, depending upon the weather. As those butterflies move north, they move through northern Mexico into Texas, where they start laying eggs, and they spread out into this area that looks green on this map. And most of the butterflies lay eggs from the time that they start arriving in the U.S. Until they're dead, and most of them are dead by the 1st of May as we approach the upper limit of that green area. There are some exceptions to that. Some years it's different, but that's the case for most years. This is a general pattern. The offspring from those eggs that are laid by the butterflies that are returning from Mexico then start moving north at the end of April and through May and into the first week of June, and they occupy this area of yellow that you see above the green area. They occupy virtually the entire limit of milkweeds. And that means that they're going up as far north as 50 degrees north in some places. There they have 2 or 3 additional generations, and then the migration starts again in early August up around Winnipeg, and the migration begins to move south again. So while they are in Mexico, they are clustered like this in massive numbers, so massive that the limbs of the trees bend and sometimes break. But among these butterflies, there are a certain number that die, and that allows us to recover some information because we tag a lot of butterflies. As I mentioned before, we have this long-term tagging program, tagging over 2 million butterflies, and we now have over 19,000 recoveries in Mexico. And this information that we get from these recovered tagged butterflies, that we recover from the people who are close to or live near the overwintering sites, they collect these tags, and we pay them about $5 a piece for every recovered tag. And the reason we pay for those tags is that it takes quite a bit of effort to find each of these tags, and they save them in their wallets or at their homes. And then as people visit the areas, the overwintering areas, some of the people that represent us, we ask them to buy some of the tags from these people. It often takes years before we recover all the tags from a given year, because not everybody makes connections from year to year with their tags and with our buyers. But it generally works out, and we get a lot of recoveries every year. Overall recovery rate's about 1%. Well, the reason we're really here today is to discuss what or what has happened to this population over the period in which it has been most closely monitored. Monitoring really started pretty well in 94 with most of the colonies measured. And what they do is they look at all of these areas where the butterflies are clustered, and they measure the polygons of trees that are occupied by butterflies. They assemble all of those, and it gives them a total number of hectares, and each hectare is about 2.4 acres. They come up with an estimate of the total number of hectares of trees that are occupied by the butterflies. And you can see that the pattern has declined. There is a decline here that's clearly represented. From 94 to 19, the average number of hectares was 5.56 hectares, and now from 2004 to 2019, the average has gone down to 3.42, with some remarkably low years among those, including the period from 2012 through 2014. In 2013-14, that particular overwinter, there were only 0.67 hectares, and that created quite a bit of alarm about what we should do about monarch conservation. And as you probably are aware, there is going to be a decision made in December as to whether the monarch should be declared a threatened species or not, which is partly based on these declining numbers. So the issue then is, what has caused this decline? Has it been some sort of change out there, some sort of long-term continuous process that has affected this population? Well, there are quite a number of reasons that monarchs might be declining. One is the application of glyphosate to glyphosate-tolerant corn and soybean fields, the economics associated with biofuels, the conversion of rangeland and grasslands for those biofuels, development, and so on and so forth. There are just a number of issues, but what we're looking for is what are the really big issues? What is the big driver in the system? That's the question. Well, when we take a look at what has happened in agriculture, it's pretty clear that there has been a major shift. All of those living in the Midwest were very much aware of the fact that milkweed was a low-level contaminant of soybean fields and cornfields. And the study that was done in the year 2000 showed that more monarchs were produced per acre in corn and soybean fields than in any other habitat. More were produced in corn and soybeans than in roadside areas, pastures, more or less natural areas, and so on. There was a big impact of this habitat on the population. There are a lot of butterflies produced in this population. And in spite of efforts by farmers at this point to get rid of milkweed. But in the early 2000s, this all changed, because Roundup Ready corn and soybean varieties were produced and quickly adopted by the growers out there, and that resulted in the elimination of milkweed in corn and soybean fields. And with that elimination, we began to be quite concerned, because butterflies appear to be disappearing from the landscape. Now, the milkweed that we're talking about is the common milkweed, and you can see that it has more or less a north and northeasterly distribution. That doesn't quite show the whole picture here, because the plant is much more common in the northern latitudes than it is at the southern part of this occupied distribution. Well, as the milkweed disappeared as a result of the application of herbicide-tolerant plants to the landscape, we began to see a decline in monarch butterflies. Now, we should be very clear that there are a couple of things going on here. One is that you've got a habitat issue, and the other one is that you have issues that are associated with the climate per se. The climate isn't always favorable for the growth of this population. So if you look at 2000 and you look at the year 2000, and you can see that the overall population was quite low at the end of the year 2000. Why was that? That was clearly the result of a drought that did kill a lot of monarchs during the migration southward. But you see that the population quickly recovered from that. 2001, 2002, 2003, we had much larger populations. But we had another population decline that was pretty sharp in 2004. That again was due to a weather event. It was extremely cold that summer, and that basically limited the reproductive success of the butterflies. And you can see in 2009 we had another dip, and that was also related to having an extremely cold summer. But there is no obvious reason why the population shouldn't have rebounded to pre-2004 levels from 05, 06, 07, 08. Those populations were down. Why were they down? Well, it looked like to us that they were down because of the decline in the milkweed that was out there. And further, this graph goes on. You can see that the adoption rate was going up and the population was going down. So there was another thing that happened around 2007. At the end of 2007, President Bush signed the Renewable Fuel Standard. The Renewable Fuel Standard asked farmers to produce a lot more corn so that could be converted into alcohol, and the alcohol could then be put into our gasoline so that we would be in effect less dependent on foreign sources for our petroleum products and to run our automobiles, et cetera, et cetera. Well, this was a very effective program. I mean, this effectively was a subsidy for corn production, and what that meant was that there was a premium on planting corn because the demand for corn for alcohol was quite high. And what the result was, which was rather remarkable, was that 24 million acres of landscape were converted to accommodate more corn production. This meant that a lot of marginal lands, a lot of grasslands, and so on were converted to croplands that had not been used for crops previously. The effect of this was to change the map kind of blue. All of the grains in the upper Midwest were moved out to the grasslands. And you can see that as the blue indicates that there was a lot of conversion in the grasslands that are within and to the west of this particular corridor that we're talking about, this milkweed monarch corridor. So that was another thing that happened that was really quite striking and clearly had an effect on the amount of milkweed out there. And if you look at grasslands, grasslands constituted 77% of that converted nearly 24 million acres. That's a lot of grassland to lose because you're losing grassland birds, pollinators, monarch butterflies, and a lot of other things that use those habitats. So this was a major shift, and it only took 4 years to completely shift 24 million acres in land use. Well, that was all fine and well. We understood that habitat was declining, and then some colleagues of ours came along and proposed another reason for the decline in the monarch population, and that is that for some reason there was a lot of failure during the migration that contributed to the low overwintering numbers. In other words, they proposed an entirely different hypothesis. So the way it sorts out is that we have two hypotheses. One is the milkweed limitation hypothesis. The other one is the migration mortality hypothesis. These were in contrast to each other. The people in advocating the migratory failure hypothesis seemed not to acknowledge that there was a lot of decline in habitat. They pushed the agenda that there was simply no other way to explain what was going on except that there was a decline in migratory success, that there had to be some failure. I won't go into the reasons that doesn't make any sense demographically, but it was baffling because no evidence was presented in support of that hypothesis. So we got busy in trying to analyze the tagging data to see if the tagging data had some relevance to answering this question. Is it really milkweed limitation, that is a decline in habitat available, or is there increasing mortality during the migration? And with a long record of monarchs recovered in Mexico that had been tagged, we should be able to sort this out. Well, one of the things that bothered us about this is that all of the data that was used to come up with a supposed migratory failure hypothesis was derived from these areas where there are stars. The two lower stars represent sampling sites of midsummer butterflies, NABA counts, that is North American Butterfly Association counts that are made in August, sometimes in July. They're supposed to be July 4th counts. And then we had 3 stars there that indicate that there are fall migrations that move through peninsulas. And the interesting thing about all of these 5 sets of data is that the people who analyzed those data said that they do not correlate with overwintering numbers. And because they don't correlate with overwintering numbers, there is a disconnect. And this disconnect demanded that there had to be another explanation. And that led to the migratory failure hypothesis. Well, yes and no. You've got a problem here. When you've got your independent variables that don't correlate with your dependent variables, you've got 3 choices as a researcher. That's the way I see it. And I'm not a statistician, but I work with correlations all of the time. And what you can see when you don't have a correlation with an independent variable with a dependent variable is that you can ask yourself, is my data, or I should say are my data, because data are always plural, are my data adequate to measure? Is my independent variable useful in this question? Or you can say, oh yes, of course it's useful, and of course it tells everything, and you can go ahead and say there's a disconnect, as these authors did. The third thing that you can do as a researcher is you can say, oh my goodness, the dependent variable is really not very reliable, and therefore we shouldn't expect a correlation. Well, that question wasn't asked either, and the dependent variable is assumed in this particular case to be relatively representative of the overall population. So this also bothered us because we know, and we knew from and you can see it on this particular graph, this particular illustration, that all those black dots are 90, west of 90, longitude 90. And that's where recoveries, those are all recoveries. And if you look at the number of butterflies tagged and the number of butterflies recovered, it's very, very clear that west of 90 we have a major success rate relative to east of 90. And it gets even worse if you go east of 80. So, looking at this population from the standpoint of the geography, it would have been much more useful to have all of these measures west of 90, because that's where most of the monarchs are produced that reach Mexico. All right, let's examine this hypothesis. The supposition is that mortality during the fall migration determines overwintering population size, and increasing mortality during the migration over the years is responsible for the population decline. And that leads to some certain expectations. One, that the summer monarch population size is not correlated with overwintering population size. 2, that migration success is correlated with overwintering population size. What that says is that the number of butterflies in a migration should determine, and their success at reaching Mexico should be really well correlated with the total number of butterflies at the overwintering sites. And the third thing is that migration success has declined over the last 2 decades. There should be a distinctive pattern here, a representation that indicates that somehow migratory success has declined consistently and with a pattern that supports the hypothesis. Well, let's take a look at what we have available from the monarch tagging. All of these blue dots represent places where monarchs were tagged over the period from 2004 to 2015. Or actually, I'm sorry, that's 1998 through 2015. And that represents something like 8,400, almost 8,400 locations. And it represents well over 1.3 million butterflies. So we do a lot of tagging, and it ought to tell us something. And that tagging, I think that tagging rules. That's an amazing amount of data. Well, let's see what it looks like. Well, we have two things to deal with. We have wild butterflies that are tagged and released, or that are caught, tagged, and released. And then we have people who rear monarch butterflies, and then they tag them and they release them. So we have those two groups, and we know they differ a little bit. And we look at how that correlates with the overwintering population. And you can see here at the bottom that the R-square is 0.54, the probability is 0.0004, that this is a distribution by that's equal to chance. So it's highly probable that there is a strong correlation here, that there is a relationship that is associated with tagging and the overwintering numbers. But it gets even better if we pull out the reared butterflies, since those reared butterflies have a lower chance of getting to Mexico. And we look at this now, we've got an R-square that is 0.72, almost 0.73, as opposed to 0.54 when we concluded all of the data. So again, there's a very strong correlation between the number of wild monarchs tagged from 2004 through 2015 and the overwintering numbers. And if we look at both the overwintering numbers and the number of butterflies tagged, we would expect there to be some correlation between the two, right? And there is generally a pretty good correlation. If you look at 2005, which is right in the middle there, you see that the number of butterflies tagged and the overwintering numbers were kind of right on. They were a complete overlap, and you can see a number of other years like 2008 where they're really close. But you know, this is really kind of remarkable that the number of butterflies tagged and the number of butterflies at the overwintering sites is pretty well correlated. And we're looking at the number of butterflies out of the Midwest rather than all of the butterflies from all over the country. Now, there are some interesting things in this figure here. One, you can see a substantial disconnect from 2000. In 2000, you can see that there were a lot of butterflies tagged, but you can see that the overwintering numbers were low. Why were the overwintering numbers low? Well, that was the most severe drought in the entire period. And that drought apparently took out a lot of the butterflies that were tagged, and perhaps a lot of the wild butterflies as well. And the result was that there is a distinctive pattern there. So the drought contributed a lot of mortality during the migration, and that does support the idea that migrations can have a lot of mortality. But there is no overall pattern there. You can see that that relationship does not hold for all of these spots, all of these years. In fact, there is overall a much tighter relationship between the number tagged and the overwintering population size than we would certainly expect on the basis of chance. So we can take a look at the proportion of tags recovered per year, and we can see that, and this is for all years, and this is go from 98 through 15, and you can see that there's no significance here. This line should dip down to the right if the hypothesis is correct, and it doesn't. And if we pull the data out so that we're just looking at the Midwest for different years, the recovery rate is again expressed as a proportion, and we pull out the years 2001, 2003, 2015, because there was a severe winter mortality due to winter storms in those years. But otherwise, again, you can see that there is no correlation, no significant trend in recovery rate. The recovery rate does not dip down to the right as expected. So to make the point again about the differences in longitude, let's take a look at this tagged, recovered, and tags per recovery by longitude relationship. So as you may have recalled from the earlier figure, we had 90 west, which is just west of Madison, Wisconsin. So if we take a look at what happens from 90 west onward, we can see that we had about almost 41% tagged of 100 to 90 west, And then we had a few more tagged from 100 to 110. And then if we look at the recovered, which is just below that, you can see that we had pretty good recovery rates for those two areas. And then if you look over to the right and you look at 90 to 80, you can see that the figures drop down, the recovery rate drops down. And if you look from 80 to 65, 80 being Western Pennsylvania, 65 being the Maritimes and Canada, you can see that the recovery rate drops down to 0.094. So if you go to recovered and go from left to right, you can see that the numbers recovered decline the further we move east. And so we need to understand why they're declining as they move further to the east. We also need to look at the amount of effort that it takes to get a butterfly tagged, and that tells us something as well. The tagged butterfly recovered in Mexico, that gives us another idea of what's going on. And if you look at the bottom line here, it says tags per recovery, that is the number of tags that have to be applied to get a recovery. You can see that that really increases from left to right until to the point where it's about a 10 times increase in the number of tags required to get a butterfly to Mexico from the east, 32 versus 350. Now, the bottom line here is that if we add in the tagged, if we add the first two to the left together, we get 42%, 42.1% of the butterflies tagged accounted for 71% of the recoveries. What that says is that west of Madison, Wisconsin, that's where most of the butterflies are coming from that get to Mexico. So we're looking at everything to the east of Madison as only contributing about 29% to the overwintering population. And most of those are coming out of 90 to 80. So it's the area from 80 to 65, which is again from Western Pennsylvania to the Maritimes, where there is a really, really low recovery rate. Well, let's take a look at longitude and tagging and see if we can sort this out and come up with some interesting interpretations of what might be going on here. So if we look at the percent that are recovered west of 80, it's in this particular figure, and this is from 1998, it is 0.71. And from east of 80, it's 0.011. Really a dramatic drop. In spite of the fact that 21.7% of all the butterflies tagged were from east of 80 west. And the total number of recovered butterflies, of all recovered butterflies, was only 4% in that particular year. 4%. In other words, what it says is that if you're looking at what happened in that particular year in terms of the contribution from that to the overall population from 80 west to the Maritimes, it was only contributing, at least from this figure, only about 4% of the overall butterflies that reached Mexico. Now that's of course just a sample, but it's obviously going to be very low. So let's take a look at what happens if the population really shifts and the population is not uniformly growing the same way every year, because there are different regional effects of temperature and moisture and so on and so forth. So let's take a look and see what happened in 2012. 2012, there was a drought in the Midwest. There was extreme high temperatures. This was the hottest summer in the entire period. That effectively put a cap on the Midwestern population. That population was down, and you can see that as you go from left to right here. And if you take a look at the east and west of 80 sort of summary, then you have pretty good recovery rates out of the Midwest in spite of the fact that the population was down. But east of 80 west, you have, again, a very, very low recovery rate, 0.16. In spite of the fact that about 57% of the overall butterfly population that was tagged east of 80 west. That is Western Pennsylvania again. But here's the interesting thing about this particular figure. What that tells us is that in that particular year, instead of being 4% recoveries from east of 80 of all of the recoveries, it was now 25%. So what that says is that when the population is really robust from the east, it does make a higher contribution to the overall numbers reaching Mexico, proportionally anyway, and especially in conditions where the Midwestern population is down. Well, tagging rules. Tagging has we've got a lot of data, and tagging tells us a lot about how this population is functioning. But one of the things we want to do is kind of get an idea, get a grip on what it takes to get from one point to another. And here I've got pinned out 45 north at those northern pins. Due to the curvature of the Earth, that kind of looks like it goes up on the right. Well, it is further to the right to get to what our destination is. And the destination is Del Rio, Texas, which is at the lower point here. Del Rio, Texas is the point at which most of the butterflies from the northeast cross into Mexico. So what we're going to do is look at the distance from all of those pins to Del Rio, Texas, and see how that sorts out in terms of the traverse that the butterflies have to make. And if you do that, and you estimate the number of days that it takes to reach Del Rio, Texas, then we have to imagine that the butterflies are using a kind of an average speed, and that may not be entirely correct, but we can postulate that they're moving at about 25 miles per day on average, and that seems to be consistent with much of the data that we have on how the migration moves. And what that means that at the the furthest west point, which is 45 north and 105 west, it takes them about 41 days to get to Del Rio, Texas. On the other hand, if we go to the Maritimes and we go to 45 north and 65 west, which would be right up there in the Maritimes, that takes them about 83 days to get to Del Rio, Texas. So the traverse is much longer, and it's full of a lot of hazards. You don't want to be on the road that many times. There's likely to be an accident. So if we sort out the data in terms of recoveries for latitudes across all of the longitudes, we've got something like 7,720 recovered out of over 772,000 tagged, which is about 1%. You can see how that sorts out on the basis of latitude and longitude. And you can see that the peak would be in Minnesota, where it would be 95 west, and the distance would be, which is indicated in the blue line here, would be just a little over 1,000 miles, and that's your best shot for getting to Mexico, coming out of this area west of 90. Because if you go east of 90, then your chance of getting to Mexico drops off precipitously to the point where if you're in the Maritimes or somewhere close to that, you have a very low chance of getting to Mexico, simply because the route you're taking is much, much longer. And some of the routes that they might take along the coast will never get them to Mexico. Well, again, tagging is full of rich data, and these data are, in this particular case, are allowing us to reject all of these expectations from the migration mortality hypothesis. That the summer population size is not correlated with overwintering population size. We can show that that's not true. That the migration success is correlated with overwintering population size. We can show that that's not true. And that the migration success has declined over the last 2 decades. And that clearly isn't true as well. So we need to keep them flying, which means that we need to do a lot to conserve monarch habitat. This takes us back to the fact that what's really driving this population on a large scale is the amount of habitat available. Now, when you're looking at population declines in general, I think this is the one point that I need to make to many people, and that is, if you're going to look at a long-term decline, you have to have a long-term process. And in this case, it means that you have to have a consistent process of mortality on a long-term basis or a consistent process which eliminates reproductive success on a long-term basis. And limiting reproductive success on a long-term basis is easily accomplished if your habitat is declining, so that reproductive success is in effect limited by the declining habitat available. And that is the one thing that has happened over the last 20 years. The consistent thing that has happened, and is continually happening at a rate of about 2 million acres a year, is habitat is continuing to decline. What this means is that we are not going to be able to sustain monarch populations unless we deal with the habitat issue. Habitat issue has to be sustained. We can't be losing 2 million acres a year and expect this population to continue on. It's doing pretty well if the weather conditions allow, but it's still vulnerable, and it's more vulnerable now that habitat has been eliminated in many areas of the country than it would be if the habitat were still intact. And you can see that what I'm arguing here is that it's the habitat in the Midwest that has been declining, and that's important because it is the Midwest that produces most of the butterflies that reach Mexico. Well, with that, I'll stop and we can go on to questions. And I have a lot of people to acknowledge, a lot of collaborators and a lot of people that have helped along the way. Well, thank you very much. I enjoyed giving you this little talk.
Excellent. Let's not forget, if you want to ask some questions, we got the Q&A down there, and Chip's here to answer. You can see he's live now. I just about hit his head on the camera. And we'll wait just a second to see if there's a little bit of chance for folks that are still here to work on that. All righty. I'll tell you what, I'll ask a couple of questions. Oh, here we go. Here we go. Lynn wants to know about the accessibility of these graphs.
People are welcome to use any of that material. I'm not shy.
And actually, Lynn and others, that's the whole idea of this presentation, was to put this these results after 30 years of Monarch Watch, which is a citizen science project, which students all over the planet, well, all over the North America have been contributing to. This is a chance to use their data to make a really strong scientific argument. I think it's really cool.
Many of these figures have been published. Not all of them, but many of them have, so they're fair game.
Today, I would like to know if there's teachers still helping collecting data.
Oh yes, we have a lot of teachers that are still working with their students tagging monarch butterflies. We had a really interesting recovery the other day. We had a recovery, let's see, it was from, I think it was Earlham, Iowa. I think that's right. Earlham, Iowa to Acambro, Mexico. And the butterfly was tagged on the 23rd of September. I think it was found alive in Acambro, Mexico on the 1st of November. And I had Angie calculate the distance the other day and the course of travel, and that butterfly moved approximately 38 miles per day. Whoa. For that entire period, which was pretty good. I mean, that's really good. That's a little faster than I would have expected.
That's excellent. Sarah would like to know about when somebody comes up. Sarah's a teacher here in Lawrence, and she's wondering about when somebody comes up and says, why should we care about a butterfly anyway?
Yeah, I get that a lot. Yeah. So there are many reasons we need to care about monarch butterflies. This is one of the most magnificent migrations on the planet. I mean, if you think about it, you've got a half a gram insect that comes into Eastern North America in the spring, goes through several generations, migrates in mass, actually as individuals, but in mass lands up in Mexico, overwinters, and then starts the whole process over again. There's no other insect in the world that does that. It's an iconic species, and it's an accessible species, and it's also a mark of how we are managing the habitat that we should be managing. The habitat sustains us out there. If we're not taking care of monarch butterflies, it means that we're not taking care of a lot of other things. And we can see that. You know, a lot of things are declining as we can see that, and as we can see. And the monarch butterflies are telling us that we're not being very good stewards of the environment if we're letting them go like this and letting them decline. And telling us that, hey, shape up. If you want to maintain these fantastic migratory phenomena or these fantastic biological phenomena, we have to contribute it. We are stewards of this planet, and there's no escaping it. We can't let nature just take its course and human beings just run amok around over everything. We have to step back and say, hey, if we want to preserve what's going on and we want to sustain our own population, we have to pay attention to what's happening out there. Anyway, I go on about this topic a lot.
It's not like you're passionate or anything.
No.
So we got folks from all over the country, and I think that, you know, Rich is from Ohio, but he spends his summers in Maine, and I think, or at least in New Hampshire, and he's kind of wondering what's happening to those monarchs up there in Maine. Why aren't they getting to Mexico? What do you think they're ended up?
Well, part of it has to do with the distances that graphic shows. It has to do with the distance, but it also, there are other things. I mean, there's a lot more to these data than I can really put into a little talk like this, but one of them is when they leave. They've got to leave, if they're in New Hampshire or anywhere in the Northeast, they've got to leave on time. You've got to be at the leading edge of the migration if you're going to get to Mexico. If you're a lagger anywhere in this migration, the tail end of this migration all over Eastern North America is a tail with very low recovery rates. The best recovery rates are on the first half of this migration everywhere. And in the East, the migration tends to be later than it is in the Midwest. That's because the climate is changing a little bit. It's because the seasonal patterns are a little bit different. It's also due to the fact that the colonization is later. Recolonization is later in the spring, and that means that the demographics are a little bit later. So in other words, monarchs are being produced a little bit later in the East, and they're leaving a little bit later, and they have a longer distance to go, and that means that they have a lower chance of getting to Mexico.
Do they go other places though, like Florida?
Yeah, some go to Florida. I mean, we have a big flood of monarchs coming into Tampa in October, and they don't stay non-reproductive, and they reproduce through the winter. And it's what's mystery of Florida is it a sink? That is, the monarchs just disappear into Florida, or do they come out of Florida in the spring? And there has been no established data, no data establishing that they come out of Florida in good numbers in the spring.
Okay.
So right now, Florida looks like a sink more than it looks like a source of new monarchs in the spring.
Tanea is also asking about migration issues out in California. I know you've been working on that as well. I don't know, do you want to speak to that?
It doesn't look good for the Western population. And the fact the Western population may be telling us what's going to be happening in the East eventually. I mean, we get into the whole climate change sort of dialogue here. If you look at what's been happening in California, California has been heating up faster on a per decade basis than any other part of the country, even faster than Alaska. I just worked out a graphic, which I'd be glad to share with anybody, which shows that in California, the temperature has been increasing by 0.7 degrees per decade. 0.7 degrees per decade. That's an incredible rate of increase, and that has been going on for several decades now. And the result is that California is getting much warmer, much drier, and that puts a lot of different species at risk, including monarch butterflies. The last 2 years, there have been about 30,000 monarch butterflies at the overwintering sites in California. chances are it may be less than 5,000 this year, simply because this has not been a favorable year for butterfly production out there in California due to the temperatures and due to the dryness, and due to the fall conditions, and of course due to the fires. So the California population is going down. Why is it going down? Loss of habitat is part of it, but it's really the fact that the climate is changing. And I'll send this graphic around to Brad, and he can send it around to everybody else. But what you see if you look at the United States is that you see a ring of high temperatures that are on both coasts and even on the Gulf Coast, that are a reflection of the fact that the ocean is heating up. And the ocean is heating up because of the trapping effect of greenhouse gases. And 90% of that excess energy due to greenhouse gases is absorbed in the ocean. That is changing ocean temperatures. Ocean temperatures are changing the landscape across the near coastal areas. And it's complicated, it's interesting, but it's very, very clearly a change, and it's scarier than hell.
So both of these competing hypotheses used citizen science data. Bill McComas is wondering what type of information do tag finders produce for you? So that'd be, the finders themselves. What kind of information do they provide other than just the tag? Is that right?
Yeah, that's it. They don't provide anything except the tag, and it's very, very difficult to get the people in Mexico to collect any data. They need a motivation to do that sort of thing, and we don't have the ability to connect with them and give them that kind of motivation to record the data, the when and the where they collect every butterfly. We know approximately in which colonies every butterfly comes from, and that they're found dead, but that's all that we can tell you.
Okay, so here's one of our citizen science controversial questions for you. And that is, do you breed butterflies in a controlled environment? And if you do, what about releasing those in the wild?
Well, we do a lot of rearing. We maintain continuous cultures of monarch butterflies for research purposes and for the purposes of education. We send out a lot of kits to schools around the country. People are using monarch butterflies in schools to educate students about the life cycle of butterflies and about the migration and so on. A few of those teachers that acquire the monarchs from us actually do tag them and release them. That has provided some interesting data. We do not, as a rule, rear a lot of butterflies for the purpose of tagging and releasing them. I did a little bit of that this fall for the very, very first time, and just as an experiment to see whether our butterflies have any chance of migrating. Our butterflies are reared on an artificial diet, and so they have a number of strikes against them. I don't expect many, perhaps any of them, to ever be recaptured.
Okay, so one of the reasons, as I said, I asked Chip to do this is so that the community would have a set of resources if they chose to feature monarch biology in the classroom in some kind of quantitative exercise with their students. And Stacy's asked about, have you, Chip, had a conversation, an academic conversation with the folks with the competing hypothesis recently in papers, in response papers, where we might be going back and forth, or letters where she could include those in her classes for, classroom discussion and analysis?
Yeah, there's a paper that just came out this week that it's in kind of a preprint form. It isn't the final form yet. That purports to deal with a lot of data which would suggest that monarchs were never in danger, whatever that means. I haven't really read the paper yet, but there's a lot of data in the paper, and it's in the supplementary information to the paper, and that, from what I've seen of it, a lot of it can be challenged. I mean, from what I know. one of the difficulties here when dealing with monarch butterflies is that we don't have a good demographic model. We don't really know how this population functions very well. And so this allows people to come up with all sorts of data sets and to offer all sorts of hypotheses. But these hypotheses are not based on a foundation of a real understanding about how the population works.
Okay. All righty. I think that's just getting pretty close to the time we have allotted. I think that's just about it. Do you have anything more you'd like to add there, Chip?
No, I think I'm happy, but you know, keep an eye on what's going to happen with monarch butterflies if you're going to be in this game for a long time, because monarch butterfly populations are probably going to continue to decline as the climate continues to change. And I think the West Coast is telling us something very significant about what's happening on the planet. And I think we have to pay attention very closely here. I don't think that the monarchs will be declared as threatened at this particular decision point. And I'd be happy with that. On the other hand, I think monarchs will be declared as threatened, maybe even endangered in the future, because things are changing and we're not doing much about it. Hopefully, with a new administration, we'll get back on the climate accord and be at peace with this and try to do something about climate change.
What, did you just make a presidential claim here that's not there yet?
No, it's already there. I mean, we have already heard that the climate accord is going to be rejoined.
So yes, Carol put up a link to the Monarch Watch if you want to engage your students in tagging. And there's also a project at Monarch Watch about waste stations, which is improving habitat. So you can become involved in more than one direction. Okay. Well, thank you so much, Chip. That's a real privilege to have you here and real special to me. And Carol, she's around here. Here she is. She's
Hey,
coming
Chip.
in behind us.
Thank you.
Hey, Carol.
All right.
All right. Well, happy to be here and happy to help you guys, and happy to talk about monarch butterflies anytime.
Okay. Thanks.
All right.
All right.
Ciao.
Bye.